Hello, my name is Carol Faulkner, and I'm a professor of history at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. The year 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, and thus the 250th anniversary of the United States. This series of lectures is inspired by the Maxwell School's mission of citizenship and public affairs. And throughout the series, we will explore important issues and moments in the 250-year history of the United States. Though we will address many different topics throughout the semester, the key question we will consider throughout the class is how has the United States lived up to its founding principles of equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of these ideals are stated in the Declaration of Independence, and it is that document and its local and global impact that we will focus on today. My argument today is that the Declaration was a distinctive type of document, a declaration of principles for a new kind of society that inspired other declarations during the Age of Revolutions. I refer to it as the Age of Declarations, and my analysis of these declarations will take us from 1776 to 1848. We will start with the Declaration's author, Thomas Jefferson, discuss the form and structure of the Declaration and its significance, and finally examine other declarations. This lecture will reveal an evolution of demands that built on the Declaration, but called for its promises to include more people. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, its high ideals were far from reality. The author of the Declaration is the best example of those contradictions. So who was Thomas Jefferson? He was a lawyer, he was a Virginia slaveholder, a future president, and he had a long-term coercive sexual relationship with the enslaved woman, Sally Hemings. Together, they had at least 6 children. 4 of them lived to be adults. Thomas Jefferson owned and traded in hundreds of enslaved people over his lifetime. He only freed 8, all of whom were members of the Hemings family, and of these hundreds of enslaved people that he owned. The freed Hemingses did not include Sally. And I have on the slide a picture of one of the women who was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, but not Sally Hemings, because as far as I know, there are no extant pictures, images of Sally Hemings. Historians have long debated what Jefferson's slaveholding and racism mean for our understanding of the Declaration. Did he intend to exclude Blacks from the Enlightenment principles he espoused? How did he reconcile slavery and liberty? While historians disagree, I think it's safe to say that Jefferson knew that slavery was wrong, but he also thought that Blacks were inferior and could never be fully integrated into American society. In an early draft of the Declaration, Jefferson criticized King George III for promoting the Atlantic slave trade, but this passage was deleted by the Continental Congress. Jefferson's ambivalence can also be seen in his notes on the state of Virginia from 1781. And as you can see in the language on the slide, he said, "To our reproach, it must be said, that though for a century and a half we have had under our eyes the races of Black and of red men, they have never yet been viewed by us as subjects of natural history." Right? So this is a reproach to white Americans. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both of body and mind. This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. And one of the things he does is says, well, what would happen if slavery ended? Some of these, embarrassed by the question what further is to be done with them, join themselves in opposition with those who are actuated by sordid avarice only. Among the Romans, emancipation required but one effort. The slave, when made free, might mix with, without staining the blood of his master. But with us a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. So Jefferson was saying emancipation, the end of slavery, is impossible unless people of African descent leave the country, because race mixture would be problematic for the nation. This, of course, is despite the fact that he is participating himself in race mixing. While slavery was the biggest contradiction at the founding of the country, another often goes unremarked. Jefferson definitely did not intend to include women in the statement, all men are created equal. Later, others would correct these two great absences from the Declaration. So we're moving on to the form of the Declaration of Independence and its significance. The structure of the Declaration of Independence accomplished two things. First, it was a statement of principles based on Enlightenment values of liberty, representative government, and the rule of law. Second, the goal was to justify independence from England. The primary audience was King George III of England, who was ultimately delivered a copy, but it is unclear if he ever read it. The second major audience was the American colonists. The Declaration was printed and distributed widely. One scholar has identified over 700 printings between 1776 and 1826. It was read aloud and continued to be so on every July 4th holiday into the next century. It was a document that was deeply familiar to Americans, both white and black, and thus easy to adapt for their own goals and ideals. The first part, the Statement of Principles, is the most famous. It contrasts the tyranny of the king with the equality of mankind and their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration states that governments must protect and ensure these rights. When the government does not serve this function, Jefferson writes, quote, "It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." Jefferson repeats the language of a right and duty to throw off despotism, and in response to a, quote, "long train of abuses and usurpations," he justifies himself not only to the king, but to his fellow colonists and to the world. This part of the Declaration gives us insight into what the founders conceived of as a good society and government. The government, they believed, exists to secure men's rights, and the government may only exist with the consent of the governed. What follows is the long train of abuses and usurpations. Jefferson and the Continental Congress were concerned with some familiar outrages. The king has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislature, for quartering large bodies of armed troops against us, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, and for imposing taxes on us without our consent, depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. But there are others that are more obscure and interesting. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. So Jefferson and the founders actually wanted to encourage immigration, and they were critical of George III and the British government for blocking further immigration. And you can see what the relationship of immigration is to settlement, right? They want more access to land so that more people can settle and create new lands. And that's directly tied to this last grievance. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they will have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And the Declaration did inspire the colonists, including Black Americans. In 1775, England had offered freedom to any enslaved person if they fought for the British. This offer was known as Lord Dunmore's Proclamation, after the last royal governor of Virginia who had made the offer. Dunmore was a slaveholder himself, but he needed troops. Many Virginia slaves and slaves from across the colonies took the British up on this offer, and many died fighting for the British. Other Black Americans were inspired by the Declaration to fight with the colonists against the British Empire in hopes that the new society would be dedicated to equality and liberty. For example, Prince Hall, a free Black man living in Boston, served in the colonial forces and encouraged other Black men to do so as well. He also petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for emancipation based on the Declaration of Independence. And you can see his petition here, language from his petition in 1777. That your petitioners apprehend that they have, in common with all other men, a natural and inalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatever, but they were unjustly dragged by the cruel hand of power from their dearest friends, and some of them even torn from the embraces of their tender parents. They therefore humbly beseech your honors to give this petition its due weight and consideration, and cause an act of the legislature to be passed, whereby they may be restored to the enjoyment of that freedom, which is the natural right of all men and their children who were born in this land of liberty, may not be held as slaves. Prince Hall's petition was unsuccessful at that time, but in 1783, Massachusetts did abolish slavery through a lawsuit. So the courts ordered the end of slavery in Massachusetts. Later, abolitionists were also inspired by the Declaration of Independence. In 1830, Boston abolitionist David Walker published his radical appeal castigating Americans for failing to live up to the Declaration of Independence and for being worse tyrants to enslaved Americans than the British. His pamphlet was so radical that it was censored and copies were burned in southern states. And you can see the passion in his language here. See your declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language? Hear your language proclaimed to the world July 4th, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Compare your own language above, extracted from your Declaration of Independence, with your cruelties and murders inflicted by your cruel and unmerciful fathers and yourselves on our fathers and on us, men who have never given your fathers or you the least provocation. Others were slightly more diplomatic. In 1855, William Cooper Nell published a book titled The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, believing that this evidence of Black dedication to the American cause was an argument for freedom. This was a more mainstream acceptable argument, but still radical for inserting Black Americans into the history of the country. As he wrote, "I humbly trust that my book will deepen in the heart and conscience of this nation the sense of justice that will ere long manifest itself in deeds worthy a people who, free themselves, should be foremost to make free." His first example of these colored patriots was Crispus Attucks, who he described as the first martyr of the American Revolution in the Boston Massacre, which you can see in the engraving on the slide. He also dedicated the book to Crispus Attucks. One scholar has called the form of the Declaration of Independence a memo. In other words, the memo announces a change, explains the rationale for a change, the values and principles behind the change, and details any actions needed. It might be written by one or more people. We usually think of memos in official or corporate settings. The federal government in Washington, D.C. runs on policy memos. Syracuse University also runs on memos from one office to another, such as from a dean's office to the provost's office or vice versa. Though I find this argument about the Declaration of Independence provocative, I want to suggest that the Declaration is a form of its own and inspired others, and that perhaps the form is specific to the Revolutionary era. Declarations certainly proliferated then and were used by other social and political movements, as opposed to institutions such as governments, which might need some more formal governance structure. While there were examples of political and policy memos from the social movements of the civil rights era of the 20th century, they were far more common in the Revolutionary era. So to consider, what does it mean to declare something? To declare something is a statement of agency, of independence, and the freedom to do so. The Declaration of Independence was the first, but others followed, adapted, and arguably improved this form. During the French Revolution, revolutionaries issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789, and you can see the ideological similarities to the Declaration of Independence. It begins, "The representatives of the French people, organized as a national assembly, believing that the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole cause of public calamities and of the corruption of governments, have determined to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man, in order that this declaration, being constantly before all the members of the social body, shall remind them continually of their rights and duties." So rather than setting out grievances against the king, they continue to list principles, beginning with men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Like the Declaration, but perhaps even more so, it defines a good political order. Law is the expression of the general will. Every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representative in its foundation. It must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. All citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, are equally eligible to all dignities and to all public positions and occupations according to their abilities and without distinction except that of their virtues and talents. They also emphasize freedom of speech. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man. Every citizen may, accordingly, speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law. Like the early United States, they also placed great value in property. Since property is an inviolable and sacred right, no one shall be deprived thereof except where public necessity, legally determined, shall clearly demand it, and then only on condition that the owner shall have been previously and equitably indemnified. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was also very specific in that it was talking about men and used the masculine pronoun. But noting that man was not a universal pronoun in this instance, Olympe de Gouges, a playwright and political activist, issued the Declaration of the Rights of Woman in 1791. De Gouges demanded a representative assembly for French women. And you can see her language on the slide here. Mothers, daughters, sisters, female representatives of the nation asked to be constituted as a national assembly. Considering that ignorance, neglect, or contempt for the rights of women are the sole cause of public misfortunes and governmental corruption, they have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of woman, so that by being constantly present to all members of the social body, this declaration may always remind them of their rights and duties. They also then, you can see she's rewriting the introduction to the Declaration of Rights of Man. She also rewrites many of its clauses to be specific to women. She starts with the first item: woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on common utility. And interestingly, her emphasis on free speech is also tweaked so that it's more applicable to women. The free communication of thoughts and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of woman, since this liberty assures the recognition of children by their fathers. Every citizenness may therefore say freely, I am the mother of your child. And a barbarous prejudice against unmarried women having children should not force her to hide the truth, so long as responsibility is accepted for the abuse of this liberty in cases determined by the law. So women can't lie in this situation. So in other words, she is saying freedom of speech is essential to women because they have to be able to identify the father of their children without fear of recrimination. She ends with a call to action. Women, wake up. The tocsin of reason sounds throughout the universe. Recognize your rights. The powerful empire of nature is no longer surrounded by prejudice, fanaticism, superstition, and lies. The torch of truth has dispersed all the clouds of folly and usurpation. Her sexual radicalism is evident in another part as well, as she calls marriage the tomb of confidence and love. Following the Haitian Revolution, Haiti issued its own Declaration of Independence from France in 1804. And you can see here that independence is really the goal of this declaration. And it's important to note how they categorize and characterize the French. So they write, it is not enough to have expelled the barbarians who have bloodied our land for 2 centuries. So the French are the barbarians. It is not enough to have restrained those ever-evolving factions that one after another mocked the specter of liberty that France dangled before you. We must, with one last act of national authority, forever assure the empire of liberty in the country of our birth. We must take any hope of re-enslaving us away from the inhuman government that for so long kept us in the most humiliating torpor. In the end, we must live independent or die. Independence or death, let these sacred words unite us and be the signal of battle and of our reunion. Unlike the French declarations, it was much more focused on independence than on broader principles. And like the Declaration of Independence, its target was the French Empire rather than the British Empire. And they were very good about noting the hypocrisy of the French on the issue of the rights of man and the rights of woman. I also want to talk about 2 other declarations in the United States. The first is the Declaration of the Anti-Slavery Convention, issued at the founding meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia in 1833. This was an interracial meeting of abolitionists from all over the country, not from the South, but all over from the North. And the abolitionists were very clear to point out the symbolic importance of their meeting in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress also met. Right, so they write, more than 57 years have elapsed since a band of patriots convened in this place to devise measures for the deliverance of this country from a foreign yoke. The cornerstone upon which they founded the Temple of Freedom was broadly this, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the sound of their trumpet call, 3 millions of people rose up as from the sleep of death and rushed to the strife of blood, deeming it more glorious to die instantly as free men than desirable to live 1 hour as slaves. They were few in number, poor in resources, but the honest conviction that truth, justice, and right were on their side made them invincible. Their goal as abolitionists is to fulfill the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence. So they write, "We have met together for the achievement of an enterprise without which that of our fathers is incomplete, and which for its magnitude, solemnity, and probable results upon the destiny of the world as far transcends theirs as moral truth does physical force." And so they demand freedom for slaves. Hence, we maintain that in view of the civil and religious privileges of this nation, the guilt of its oppression is unequaled by any other on the face of the earth, and therefore that is bound to repent instantly, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free. And I want to just point out that language of repent instantly. Right? They believed slavery was a sin, that it was immoral, that it was wrong. And so they believed that everyone should come to this recognition and end slavery. And so these abolitionists were known for two things: moral suasion, which they wanted to persuade Americans that slavery was wrong, and also immediatism, that slavery was so wrong that any gradual plan for emancipation was unacceptable. Right, and this is clear in the last line as well. Their perspective. We further maintain that no man has a right to enslave or embrute his brother, to hold or acknowledge him for one moment as a piece of merchandise, to keep back his hire by fraud, or to brutalize his mind by denying him the means of intellectual, social, and moral improvement. And so they conclude by saying, the right to enjoy liberty is inalienable. To invade it is to usurp the prerogative of Jehovah. Every man has a right to his own body, to the products of his own labor, to the protection of law, and to the common advantages of society. It is piracy to buy or steal a native African and subject him to servitude. Surely the sin is as great to enslave an American as an African. These abolitionists also laid out a plan of action. They were going to form anti-slavery societies across the country, send out speakers to raise awareness, circulate pamphlets and newspapers, purify the churches, and boycott the products of slavery. But importantly, they did not mention politics. This declaration was much more overtly religious. Note that they mentioned God rather than the Creator, and ended with, quote, "With entire confidence in the overruling justice of God, we plant ourselves upon the declaration of our independence and the truths of divine revelation as upon the everlasting rock." So rather than the deism of many founders, many abolitionists were inspired by evangelical or radical Christianity. Jefferson's commitment to freedom unleashed a religious marketplace in the United States, with churches competing for members, promising individual salvation, as well as the opportunity to save the world. And certainly many of the abolitionists here were intent upon that project. At the Anti-Slavery Convention in 1833, there were only a handful of women present, and one of the only women to speak proposed this last language of upon the everlasting rock. So Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker minister and activist, suggested transposing the two words. She and other women would immediately found the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, right? They're following this declaration and its path forward. The Constitution of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, or PFAS as it was known, declared that slavery and racial prejudice were contrary to the laws of God and the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence. PFAS became the longest-lived female anti-slavery society in the country, finally closing its doors in 1870 after the passage of the 15th Amendment. Significantly, the organization was interracial for all 37 years. She and other abolitionists did use all these tactics and more over the next decades. And the Declaration of Independence remained inspirational for many 19th century American activists who continued to test its limitations. The final declaration that I'm going to talk about is the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments in 1848. So the Seneca Falls Convention is often known as the first women's rights convention in the country. It's probably more accurate to say it was the first convention solely dedicated to women's rights in the country. And it took place just down the road from Syracuse University to the west of us in Seneca Falls, New York, in the Finger Lakes region. So Lucretia Mott, who's often called the moving spirit of the convention, began her career as an abolitionist. As I mentioned, she was the only woman to speak at the founding meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society. But she was also among the first and earliest American women's rights activists. So the convention occurred in Seneca Falls, New York, because Lucretia Mott had traveled from Philadelphia to visit her sister Martha Coffin Wright in Auburn, New York, and to visit self-emancipated former slaves in Ontario, Canada. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's pictured there with her daughter Harriet, and Lucretia Mott had met at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. Stanton was living in Seneca Falls with her young family, and Mott's friends, the McClintocks from Philadelphia, were also living in nearby Waterloo. At a tea party in Jane Hunt's home in Waterloo, Mott, Martha Wright, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Jane Hunt, and Marianne McClintock decided to call a convention to focus on the social, civil, and religious condition of women. But Mott was not involved in this planning stage of the convention. She was in Auburn with her sister. While she was there, she preached at the Auburn State Penitentiary, and she also preached to parishioners at the city's Universalist Church. But in advertising the convention, when they placed advertisements in the newspaper to let people know it was happening, they mentioned Mott's presence because she was probably one of the more famous people to attend the convention. And this notice that a convention was being held to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition of women attracted approximately 300 men and women from around the region, including abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And it was important to Mott that both men and women were at the convention. She offered a resolution in support of the participation of men. Resolved that the speedy success of our cause depends upon the zealous and untiring efforts of both men and women. She was used to working in the anti-slavery movement with both men and women, and she believed that all of these causes were interrelated and required shared efforts and work. And ultimately, 32 men signed the convention's declaration. However, the convention's Declaration of Sentiments reveals little of Mott's influence. And despite the fact that she addressed the convention more than any other speaker, only a few of her remarks, such as the resolution I just read, were actually recorded in the convention's proceedings. Notably, Mott urged a large audience at the end of the first day to consider women's rights as one aspect of reforms in general. And this belief that women's rights were one element of a broader reform impulse helps explain her absence. Stanton and the McClintocks based their document on Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Mott criticized Jefferson's truth as anything but self-evident, and she preferred the American Anti-Slavery Society's declaration, which, as we know, simply stated, every man has a right to his own body, and no man has a right to enslave or imbrute his brother. While activists disagreed on the usefulness of the Declaration of Independence, Stanton and others were very deliberate, demanding the inclusion of women into the country's founding principles. As they wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Instead of the king, they listed their grievances against men. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And you can see some of their grievances here, right? And they start with political rights. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. We also see a little bit of nativism and classism in American society at the time. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. And by natives, they mean people born in the United States. Foreigners, of course, refers to immigrants. But like Olympe de Gouges, they had specific grievances as women. And perhaps the most important one is this next one. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. And so what that refers to is British common law classified single women, unmarried women, as femme souls, and married women as femme coverts, meaning covered women. So essentially, all women lost all her legal, civil rights upon marriage and was subsumed into the person of the husband for the purpose of law and society, and of course, of politics. Like Olympe de Gouges, they were also concerned with sexual morals. And you can see this in the last grievance I have on the slide. He has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from society are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account in man. And this, of course, refers to the sexual double standard. They did not want women to be able to act like men, however. They wanted there to be a single sexual standard, and they wanted that to be the standard of woman. So more chastity, more sexual morality than they perceived among their male contemporaries. They concluded, we insist that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. Importantly, there was no mention of slavery or enslaved women, which there might have been had Lucretia Mott been present when the Declaration of Sentiments was written. Mott's abolitionism also shaped her opposition to the call for women's voting rights. She believed, as a Quaker and an abolitionist, that American politics was corrupted by war and slavery. And so she did not personally want the right to vote while slavery or war existed in the land. At the Seneca Falls Convention, Stanton proposed, of course, that an essential element of man's tyranny over woman was that he had denied her inalienable right to the elective franchise. But Mott responded, "Lizzie, thou will make the convention ridiculous." If she said this, and I think it's an open question if she did or not, she undoubtedly meant that abolitionists would take exception to this demand for the vote. Years later, Mott wrote to Stanton, perhaps with some disappointment, "I've never liked the undeserved praise of being the moving spirit of that occasion, when to thyself belongs the honor, aided so efficiently by the McClintocks." Mott envisioned women's rights not as a new and separate movement, but rather an extension of universal principles of liberty and equality. So while we see the strength and impact of the values laid out in the Declaration of Independence, in other declarations, and demands for liberty, equality, and independence, or what I have called the Age of Declarations, we also see some criticisms of the Enlightenment values expressed in the Declaration as excluding large portions of the population and not taking into account the specific circumstances that might impact the ability to exercise rights to equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American Anti-Slavery Society Declaration and the Seneca Falls Declaration, as well as other documents, are part of efforts to live up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence, as well as part of an ongoing national debate over the meaning and values of the American Revolution. Thank you very much.